Mr. President, later today, the Senate will vote on Senate Bill 2093. Senate Bill 2093 is the new Senate Bill 1. It's the latest version of the so-called For the People Act, which is a massive, massive takeover, federal takeover of election law. So why are we taking up a massive federal takeover of election law? Well, that's a good question. 2 years ago, Democrats told us that we needed to pass this law because our electoral system was broken. Well, then came 2020. We had a record voter turnout, largest voter turnout since the election of 1900, largest turnout in 120 years in American history. And Democrats won the White House. After that, it got a little awkward to complain that our electoral system was broken, so Democrats found a new argument. Now we have to pass this legislation to stop states from taking away voting rights. According to Democrats, states' moves to update or clarify their election laws in the wake of pandemic challenges and vote counting confusion are really plots to restrict voter access. Of course, so far, most 2021 state election law updates have proved to be both standard and mainstream. But that hasn't stopped Democrats, who have at times resorted to outright lies in their efforts to persuade Americans that we're facing a voting rights crisis. After all, Democrats need to give some reason for why we should allow the federal government to take over our entire electoral system. And Democrats' real reason, because they think S1 will give them an advantage in future elections, is not really one that they can use to sell the bill. Although Speaker Pelosi did admit, I should say, on national television that she thought S1 would boost Democrats' electoral chances. Mr. President, the question is where to start when it comes to the bill's content. As I said, like the original S1, the new S1 is an unprecedented federal takeover of elections. Historically, running elections has largely been a matter for states who tailor election laws to the particular needs of their cities and communities. S1 would impose one-size-fits-all federal regulations on elections, in many cases, deeply problematic regulations. S1 would require states to allow unlimited ballot harvesting, which is the controversial practice of allowing political operatives and others to pick up and deliver ballots with all the possibilities for fraud that creates. It would gut state voter ID laws, laws which I would point out are supported by a strong majority of the American people. A recent poll said 80% of Americans support voter ID laws. It would remove legal penalties for registering individuals who are here illegally, and so much more. But the new S1, like the old S1, goes way beyond undermining the security of our elections and increasing the likelihood of voter fraud. It would implement public funding of political campaigns, which would mean that government dollars, money that belongs to the American taxpayer, would go to funding yard signs and attack ads. Sitting senators alone could qualify for more than $1.8 billion in public funding. And that doesn't count their challengers. Yes, with a record high debt, Democrats apparently think that dropping a couple $billion here and there on attack ads and partisan rallies is a good use of taxpayer dollars. And from there, believe it or not, the ideas only get worse. S1 would permanently undermine confidence in our electoral system by turning the Federal Election Commission, the primary enforcer of election law in this country, into a partisan body. That's right. The Democrats' bill would turn the primary enforcer of election law in this country into a partisan body. Now, I'm interested to hear how this is supposed to enhance voter confidence in our electoral system. Every single FEC ruling would be suspect. And on top of all this, Mr. President, S1 makes a concerted attack on freedom of speech. It would impose onerous new requirements and restrictions on political speech. It would open up private Americans to retaliation and intimidation simply for making a donation to support a cause they believe in. And it would allow the IRS to consider organizations' beliefs when deciding whether or not to grant them tax-exempt status. In fact, the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, actually opposed the House's version of S1 in the last Congress because the bill would, and I quote, unconstitutionally burden speech and associational rights, end quote. That's right, Mr. President. The American Civil Liberties Union opposed the legislation because the bill would unconstitutionally burden speech and associational rights. Mr. President, as hard as it is to believe when you look at the bill's provisions, S1 was billed as an election integrity bill. In fact, this legislation would undermine election integrity, making our elections less secure and more susceptible to fraud. And it would undermine voter confidence in our elections. The partisan divide in this country has reached new heights, and voters on both sides have lost confidence in our electoral process. Any election legislation that we take up should be focused on building voter confidence in the fairness of our electoral system, not undermining it. Do my Democrat colleagues seriously believe that S1 would do anything to increase voter confidence in the unbiased character of our electoral system? Do they seriously believe that their bill looks like a nonpartisan attempt to protect American elections? They can't possibly. From the newly partisan FEC to an IRS empowered to reject tax-exempt status for organizations whose beliefs it doesn't like, S1 is very clearly a bill designed purely and simply to enhance political power. The political power of Democrats' hope of the Democratic Party. It is the very opposite of a nonpartisan reform bill. And I have to ask my Democrat colleagues, do you really want an electoral system that's perceived as partisan in which half the country doesn't trust? Haven't we seen the consequences of that? Are you really prepared to sacrifice voter confidence in our electoral system just so you can win elections? Mr. President, later this afternoon we will vote on S1. And I fully expect that this legislation will be blocked. And it should be. The Senate's rules, which require the agreement of 60 senators to move forward to consider legislation, were designed for times just like these. Times when a narrow partisan majority attempts to shove through partisan legislation. Times when a partisan majority attacks the freedoms of our government that our government exists to protect. The Senate was established to act as a moderating body and to check attempts to ride roughshod over minority rights or to curtail our rights and our liberties. And today the Senate will fulfill that role and prevent this dangerous partisan takeover of our electoral system from moving forward. Mr. President, to elaborate on that point for just a moment, when I asked the question earlier on about why would you bring this bill to the floor, it's a good question, I think, knowing full well that it's going to fail and should fail later today. But why would you bring it to the floor? Well, allegedly, the reason to bring it to the floor was to provide pressures on certain Democrat members that this is the reason that they need to vote to do away with the legislative filibuster, which is something that has been part of the Senate going back to our founding fathers. In fact, the very reason the founding fathers created the United States Senate was a check and balance against majoritarian rule, against running roughshod over the rights of the minority here in the United States Senate. And the legislative filibuster has ensured and provided that protection, so much so that it was used extensively in the last 6 years when Republicans were in control of the Senate by the Democrats to filibuster legislation. In fact, it was used to filibuster coronavirus relief bills. It was used to filibuster police reform bills. It was used over and over to block the former president's nominees. And yet now, Mr. President, we are being told that the Senate needs to get rid of the legislative filibuster, and that all those Democrats, all those on the other side of the aisle who used it extensively to block Republican legislation over the past 6 years, are now believe that we need to get rid of the legislative filibuster, and that this bill is example number one for why that is necessary. Well, it's really ironic and interesting to hear members on the other side make that argument, given where they were a couple of years ago. It was just a couple of years ago, maybe 3 years ago, that 33 Democrat senators signed a letter to the Republican leader at the time, Senator McConnell, saying that we need to preserve the filibuster, the legislative filibuster in the Senate, because it's so crucial to the essence of the Senate and the protections that it provides for the rights of the minority here in the United States Senate. 33 Democrats, many of whom are still serving in this body, adopted that position. And in fact, the Democratic whip, my counterpart on the Democrat side, said a couple of years ago on a morning show, "I can tell you that it would be the end of the Senate as it was originally devised and created, going back to our founding fathers. We have to acknowledge our respect for the minority, and that is what the Senate tries to do in its composition and in its procedure." I can tell you, he said, the Democratic whip, senator from Illinois, that it would be the end of the Senate as it was originally devised and created, going back to our founding fathers. In other words, Mr. President, we need to preserve the filibuster to preserve our democracy. It's essential. That was the view as recently as a couple of years ago. And now we've got to get rid of the filibuster to preserve our democracy. 2 years later, the filibuster, the legislative filibuster, which in various forms have served our republic now for over 2 centuries. It's been a part of the United States Senate, of the checks and balances that the founders envisioned for this country. And yet here we are, bringing a bill to the floor for no other purpose than to have a show vote, to try and pressure certain Democrat senators who rightfully are defending the legislative filibuster as an essential element of protecting the rights of the minority in the Senate, of requiring cooperation and collaboration, and bringing people together on legislation. Solutions in the Senate historically, and I was a staffer here back in the 1980s. That's how long, my tenure, at least as a staffer and now subsequently as a member, goes back. But the Senate is a place where solutions tend to be found in the middle because that's required. It's required that there be 60 votes to move consequential legislation. And as a result of that, members on both sides have to come together. If you want to pass big things in the Senate, you have to figure out a way to get 60 votes. And right now, that would require, in the Senate, if you had every Democrat, 50 Democrats, you'd have to get 10 Republicans. As was the case when we had the majority in the Senate, we had to get 7 Democrats to do anything. And so in order even to move essential legislation like a coronavirus bill, we had to reach out to the other side. And it forced that compromise, that collaboration, that willingness to come together and work in a bipartisan way on solutions that are durable for this country. And Mr. President, it was really interesting in this Washington Post op-ed by Senator Sinema, where she points out, makes that very point, that if you can do something at 51 votes today, and one side blows up the rules in the Senate, that when the majority changes, and it always does in the Senate, and she points out that sometimes when you get in the majority, you think you're going to be there forever. Well, I've been here long enough to have been in the majority, in the minority, in the majority, and in the minority again. It goes back and forth. So what are you going to do then the next time the Senate majority flips, and all those things that the other side thinks are awful ideas that the Republicans have, and they would love to be able to block them, or at least force Republicans to come to the table and negotiate a solution that would require some bipartisan participation to get to 60 votes, what are you going to do then? Where we have 51 votes, when one side gets the majority, 51 votes, and we go back and forth, and we have this policy, this sort of kind of policy roller coaster that provides no certainty, no predictability, and certainly gets away from the checks and balances that the founders intended. Mr. President, the filibuster, the legislative filibuster, the rules of the Senate, the procedures of the Senate are designed to protect and preserve democracy, not to undermine it. What undermines it is cynical attempts to try and use a piece of legislation that the leadership on the other side knows is going nowhere and bring it to the floor for a show vote to put pressure on Senate Democrats who, as I said, rightfully are defending that very procedure, which has worked so well to their advantage for the past 6 years. And now we're told the reason they have to change it is because Republicans are being so, we're not cooperating, we're not, we're sticks in the mud, we're stopping and blocking things. we haven't even been in the minority now for 6 months. We spent the last 6 years in the majority as the other side extensively, and I emphasize extensively because any study of the data would suggest that, to block Republican initiatives, to force Republicans to come together to find 60 votes. That was their position and posture for the past 6 years, including 33 Democrat senators who, as recently as 3 years ago, sent a letter to the Republican leader saying that we've got to protect the legislative filibuster. Statements like the one made by the senator from Illinois that doing away with the filibuster would end the Senate as it was originally devised and created going back to our founding fathers. One of the essential elements of this republic, constitutionally, was the need for checks and balances. And the bicameral creation of the founding fathers, the House, which is based upon the majority, 2-year terms, designed to reflect the will of the people, was created, the balance and the check that was created against that was the United States Senate with 6-year terms, where you have procedures and rules that make it more difficult and challenging, that force this place to be more deliberative, to be more compromising, to consult and to work together. And so what we're doing today, you're going to get up and my colleagues on the other side are going to talk about how critical it is that we do this because all these states are enacting these terrible, terrible election reforms, as I said earlier, most of which, at least from what I've seen, are very mainstream and consistent with what the founders designed in our Constitution, and that is for states to have principal primacy when it comes to controlling and regulating elections in this country. But as I said, it was argued 3 years ago, in 2019, when this bill was introduced, that it needed to be introduced because we've got to do something to increase participation in our elections, that we really need to encourage people to be more active in our elections. We got to get people to vote, which they did in record numbers. Biggest turnout since 1900, biggest voter participation in the 2020 election, literally in 120 years in American history. So now they introduced the bill this year, and the stated reason is we've got to do this to stop all these states who are adopting these legislative solutions that are going to make it more difficult for people to vote. Well, all I can say is the rationale for what we're doing today changes depending on the year, depending on the election, but the goal is the same, and that is to create a permanent political advantage for one party. That's all this is about. And to persuade and pressure certain Democrat senators to do away with one of the fundamental elements of the United States Senate in the form of the legislative filibuster. Mr. President, I hope this vote will make at least some Democrats think twice about the wisdom of permanently politicizing our electoral system, and that it will encourage them to make sure that any future election reform proposals are genuinely bipartisan in nature. Unfortunately, I think it's more likely that Democrats are going to use this vote to argue for destroying the Senate's long-standing protections for minority rights. But today at least, the Senate will fulfill its constitutional mandate and act as a check on this attempt to undermine our basic freedoms.